The Legacy Annuity. Case 11, Volume 2, filed from Treaty 4 Territory, Oskana ka Asasteki, Regina. The companion to Case 10. Case 10 gave us a single project, $250 million, 3 failed rollouts, workers unpaid for weeks, the Saskatchewan Health Authority's Ames catastrophe, and the hiring architecture that made it inevitable. The institution selects for tolerance of process rather than for capability to deliver. Case 11 widens the lens. The Provincial Auditor's December 2025 report contains a second finding alongside the Ames finding. The Enterprise Business Modernization Project, EBMP, managed by Sask Builds and procurement itself. $260 million projected. $130 million overrun. 2.5 years late. $500 million between the two projects. And, the auditor finds, the portfolio-level rate of return, 20 IT projects monitored in 1 fiscal year, 8 over budget, 12 late. One client lost more than $4 million before cancellation, 60% over, 60% late. That is the baseline rate, Captain, not an outlier. Then the $500 million pair is the visible portion of a much older pattern. The structural argument of Case 11 is that Saskatchewan's public institutions have converted their internal technical and managerial capability into a permanent rent stream for external vendors. The modernization vocabulary launders the drift. The drift is the case. Section 1. The Double Clusterfuck. The Saskatchewan editorial reporter, Tammy Robert, paired the two projects publicly in January 2026 in her Substack publication, Our Sask, under that name, EBMP Ames. The pairing is structurally correct. Walk us through it. The Provincial Auditor's 2025 report, Volume 2, contains 2 findings in 2 different chapters that together describe one operation. The first finding is on the Saskatchewan Health Authority's Administrative Information Management System. Approximately $250 million spent. 3 failed rollouts across 3 years, the scheduling component cancelled, and the system reverted to its legacy predecessor on ministerial order. That is Case 10. And the second finding, the Enterprise Business Modernization Project, managed not by the Saskatchewan Health Authority, but by the Ministry of Sask Builds and Procurement itself. EBMP is the Government of Saskatchewan's parallel attempt to overhaul provincial administrative systems and modernize the back-office operations of its ministries. The auditor reports EBMP is projected at $260 million to fully implement, following a $130 million budget overrun and a 2.5-year delay as of the 31st of March, 2025. $500 million of attempted back-office IT modernization. Run through 2 parallel projects in 2 adjacent corners of the same provincial procurement architecture. Both projects produce the same outcome at different speeds. The official framings of each have stressed that the projects are difficult, the technology complex, the integration challenges substantial. Both framings, taken individually, are unfalsifiable. Taken together, with the same architecture producing the same outcome in 2 locations, they describe a property of the architecture rather than of the projects. The pairing is the point. One outcome at 2 velocities is not 2 coincidences. It is one architecture twice. Section 2. The Portfolio-Level Finding. The Provincial Auditor's examination of the Central IT Project Monitoring Function, the part of Sask Builds and Procurement that monitors IT projects across most of the Government of Saskatchewan, produced a finding the modernization vocabulary cannot absorb.
Let us hear it precisely.
Between April 2024 and March 2025, the Ministry monitored 20 IT projects with a combined forecast of approximately $40 million. 8 of those 20 projects ended over budget. 12 of the 20 were delivered late. One unnamed client spent more than $4 million on a project before it was cancelled, in the auditor's own carefully neutral phrasing, due to the vendor's inability to meet the client's requirements.
40% over budget, 60% late.
1 in 20 cancelled outright after 7 figures of spending. These are not the figures of an institution whose IT delivery is occasionally challenged by particularly complex projects. These are the figures of an institution whose IT delivery is, as a baseline, not functional.
And the auditor's recommendations.
5. Focused on improvements to monitoring, formal reporting requirements, percentage on time and budget tracking, completeness assessment of client-reported risks. The recommendations address what the Central Ministry can see and act on. They do not address what the underlying institutional capability deficit is or where it came from.
Which is appropriate.
Precisely. That is not the provincial auditor's job. It is the job of the responsible ministers and senior public service leadership who have had the data on this pattern for years. In successive auditor cycles, in successive parliamentary questioning, in the cumulative documentary record of each failed project after the next, and who have continued to characterize each new failure as a difficult particular case, rather than as a property of the system the cases are emerging from.
The pattern is the case.
The pattern is the case.
Section 3. The legacy precedent.
The current cycle is the visible part of a much older pattern. To see it, we return 12 years to Sask Energy.
2013.
In its 2013 report, Volume 1, the Provincial Auditor of Saskatchewan published Chapter 19, Securing Sask Energy's SCADA System. SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition, is the system Sask Energy uses to monitor and control compressor stations, pipelines, and related equipment across its natural gas distribution network. That network serves approximately 358,000 customers in 92% of Saskatchewan communities. SCADA is, in operational terms, the system that runs the pipelines.
And the finding.
For the audit period of September 2012 to February 2013, the provincial auditor found that Sask Energy did not have effective processes to secure its SCADA system. The audit identified gaps across threat and risk assessment, policies and procedures, and the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system.
12 years ago.
The audit also recorded, in its own framing, that critical infrastructure providers like Sask Energy and Sask Power are interdependent, such that a failure to provide services by one of the providers could lead to the failure of services provided by another. The auditor's own statement of the systemic risk implication of one Crown's capability gap is 12 years old.
And before that,
the 2002 Provincial Auditor Report on Government IT Systems generally identified capability gaps at Sask Energy and Highways and Transportation, among others. The starting node of the public record drift. From 2002 through 2013, through 2020, through 2022, through 2025, the audit cycles trace a continuous line.
And the follow-up rates are respectable.
76% of recommendations fully implemented after first follow-up. 87% after subsequent. The audit function works, What it is doing is identifying point gaps and securing point remediations. What it is not doing, because it cannot structurally, is preventing the next gap from emerging in the adjacent system or addressing the upstream institutional condition that produces gap after gap across 2 decades.
The audit reports are the visible record of the drift.
They are not a brake on it.
Section 4. The vendor annuity.
The structural question the public record leaves open, and the question this case is specifically about, is what fills the institutional capability gaps the auditor documents.
Start with the auditor's own example.
The 2025 report describes the client who spent more than $4 million before canceling a project due to the vendor's inability to meet the client's requirements. That is the case study in microcosm.
Unpack it.
The client institution did not have the internal capability to recognize, before signing the contract, that the vendor could not deliver. The client institution did not have the internal capability to recognize, during the $4 million spend, that the project was failing. The client institution discovered the vendor's inability only at the point of cancellation. The vendor, meanwhile, was paid for the work delivered up to the cancellation, regardless of whether that work met the requirement.
That is the shape of the annuity.
An institution that has hollowed out its own technical and managerial capability cannot, by definition, oversee a vendor competently. It cannot specify requirements precisely. It cannot evaluate proposals critically. It cannot manage execution actively. It cannot recognize failure early. It cannot conduct meaningful audit. It cannot conduct a replacement procurement competently when the current vendor's contract ends.
Each incapacity translates into vendor leverage.
The vendor's continued engagement becomes the institution's only continuity of operation. The annual contract becomes a permanent retainer. The modernization never finishes because the institution that cannot oversee the current vendor cannot complete the replacement that would end the vendor's engagement either.
And the new modernization projects.
AIMS, EBMP, the others. The same dynamic governs. The new project's vendor is selected by an institution that lacks the internal capability to evaluate the proposal critically. The new project's execution is overseen by an institution that lacks the internal capability to recognize early failure. The new project, predictably, joins the 8 of 20 over budget cohort and the 12 of 20 late cohort. The transformation journey has produced not a transformation, but the next layer of the same annuity. The vendor changes, the annuity continues.
Section 4.5. The mechanism of award.
Section 4 describes the annuity's existence. The mechanism by which it is renewed is observable in the process itself. The relevant receipts are in the Saskatchewan Public Record.
The architecture in public description.
SaskTenders.ca, administered by Sask Builds and Procurement, posts opportunities. Any qualified business may register. Saskatchewan has, since 2016, maintained a public lobbyist registry, transparent, competitive, accountable, on its own description.
In operation, 6 mechanisms.
Reducing the set of effective bidders to a small, mutually known cohort, each, in isolation, defensible. The aggregate is the annuity.
First, the threshold barrier.
Above open tender thresholds, suppliers must satisfy pre-qualification, security clearance, bonding, insurance, and trade agreement requirements. A firm that has never won government work cannot easily clear these. A firm that has cleared them once tends to retain that status. The set of firms eligible for large Saskatchewan IT contracts is, on the structural evidence, 5 to 10 at any given time.
Second, the time barrier.
The provincial auditor documented this directly. In a 2019 special audit of eHealth Saskatchewan, Auditor Judy Ferguson tested 3 procurement requests and found eHealth gave vendors only 5 to 10 days to respond. The auditor's characterization: the short window could increase the likelihood that some may not see the request. A firm with no prior relationship cannot meaningfully respond. A firm with in-place proposal infrastructure can. On the auditor's own framing, a filter.
Third, biased specifications.
The Canadian International Trade Tribunal in MTS Allstream 2005 found mandatory requirements biased the technical specifications in favor of the incumbent. The tribunal distinguished requirements favoring a natural incumbent advantage from those that unfairly biased the process by establishing standards impossible for other bidders. The tender is drafted by the client institution, which, as Case 10 establishes, has hollowed out its capability. It consults vendors familiar with the environment. The vendor consulted is the incumbent. Technically fair, structurally captured.
Fourth, vendor hospitality.
Same 2019 eHealth audit. 8 instances of vendor-sponsored travel without specific contractual provisions, including the PGA Championship and the Indianapolis 500. 2 trips resulted in the vendor receiving a contract. 10 contracts sole-sourced without written justification. The vendor in the 2017 PGA case, Lexmark, had received approximately $2.6 million in eHealth contracts since 2015.
And the institution's response.
A September 2018 email obtained by CBC: all contracts with the companies involved have been reviewed, and it was determined that no follow-up action was required. The auditor's findings 8 months later said otherwise. The trip happened, the contracts followed. The institution reported no follow-up required. The provincial auditor reached a different conclusion.
Fifth, the definitional mechanism.
Operating now. June 2025, the Saskatchewan NDP released FOI documents showing Sask Builds had awarded 666 contracts in fiscal year 2024 to 2025. The government had stated approximately 90% of contract value went to Saskatchewan-based companies. The NDP's analysis: only 51% of contracts and 58% of dollars went to firms headquartered in Saskatchewan. Companies classified as Saskatchewan-based included Crum Rubber Manufacturing of Newport Beach, California, and Mitsubishi of Canada in Ontario. The definition is drawn from the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Legally defensible. Also sufficiently elastic that a California rubber manufacturer is a Saskatchewan business. The headline is the laundering. The composition is what it covers.
Sixth, broker and sub-hire.
Cleanest demonstration for the moment, federal. 2020 to 2024. GC Strategies, a 2-person firm with no in-house IT delivery, won contracts, including approximately $19.1 million related to Arrive Can. Work performed by subcontractors. June 2025. Ineligible for 7 years. The Auditor General characterized the case as in line with previous audits. The same mechanism operates in any jurisdiction whose architecture admits pre-qualification barriers, incumbent favoring filters, and absent internal client capability. Saskatchewan satisfies all three.
And the close.
6 mechanisms, each defensible in isolation. The aggregate is the annuity, renewed at each procurement cycle across the entire portfolio. The cohort that benefits does not need to formally coordinate to behave like a cartel. The mechanism is the architecture. The architecture is the case.
Section 5, where this case meets the volume.
Read together with the surrounding cases, the laundering pattern becomes one operation seen from multiple angles.
Case 10.
The user-facing symptom. The Saskatchewan Health Authority's aims catastrophe and the hiring architecture that filters out the senior capability needed to prevent it. The institution's hiring process selects for tolerance of institutional process rather than for capability to deliver. Case 10 names the upstream cause in human capital terms.
Case 11.
The downstream consequence in vendor relationship terms. The institutions produced by the hiring architecture cannot oversee vendors, and the vendor relationships become permanent annuities. The same capability deficit that produces aims produces EBMP, the Sask Energy SCADA findings, and the broader 20 projects in a year pattern.
And Case 12, forthcoming.
The brokerage layer, the access network, Strategy Corp and adjacent firms with credential circuit careers operating through them, that supplies vendors into these institutional capability voids, connects the hollowed-out Crown Corp on the demand side with the vendor on the supply side.
3 cases, 1 operation.
In 3 movements. Hiring practices produce institutional incapacity. Institutional incapacity produces vendor dependency. Vendor dependency is brokered through the access layer. The access layer's credentials are themselves produced by the same public service architecture. The loop closes.
And the annuity continues.
Each modernization feeds the next cycle. The public account treats each cycle as a discrete project with discrete challenges. The structural reality is one architecture, observable in the public record across at least 2 decades.
Section 6. Why this is laundering.
The laundering operation this case describes is not primarily about money, although the money is real. It is about capability. What is being laundered is the absence of internal institutional capability, which is rendered in public discourse as a transformation journey, a modernization initiative, a complex undertaking requiring partners with deep expertise.
Each phrase is technically accurate.
None of them names the underlying condition, that the institution speaking the phrase no longer possesses the capability to do what it is contracting external partners to do, and has not possessed that capability for long enough that no one in the institution now alive remembers when it did.
A new layer of the laundering taxonomy.
The capability layer, not previously named in the volume and identified here for the first time. Reputation laundering works because the institution borrows another entity's reputation to cover its own. Capability laundering works because the institution borrows another entity's capability and describes the borrowing as its own modernization.
The vendor delivers.
The institution puts its name on the deliverable. The public account describes the institution as having modernized when what has actually occurred is the institution has paid a vendor to do work the institution no longer knows how to do.
And the audit reports cannot address that.
Audit assesses whether institutional processes are effective, identifies gaps, recommends improvements. What audit cannot do, structurally, is observe that the underlying condition, the institutional capability deficit, is being laundered into the modernization vocabulary. That would require an audit of institutional self-description, not of institutional processes. Such an audit is not within the auditor's mandate.
And the cost.
Paid in two currencies. The taxpayer pays in cash, well into the billions over the 2 decades the pattern is documented to have run. The institution's own workforce pays in the absence of internal advancement, the loss of professional respect within the institution as the work is described by managers who cannot do it. The steady migration of capable people to private sector employers who pay more and treat them as professionals.
And the vendors hire some of them.
Completing the loop in personnel terms. The people who used to work for the Crown Corporation now bill the Crown Corporation through the vendor that employs them.
Section 7. What this case does not claim.
It does not claim that all external vendor engagement is laundering. Many specific vendor relationships are appropriate, well-managed, and produce value commensurate with their cost. The structural pattern observed here is about the aggregate condition of institutional capability across multiple crowns and ministries over 2 decades, not about any single contract.
It does not claim that the auditor has failed.
On the contrary, the audit function has done what it is structurally designed to do: surfaced point gaps, issued recommendations, tracked implementation, produced a continuing public record across decades. The structural critique the case offers is precisely about what audit cannot address, not about audit failing to address things within its mandate.
And it names no individual.
It does not claim that any specific named senior official at any specific Crown Corporation or ministry is responsible for the institutional capability deficit. The deficit is the inheritance of 2 decades of incremental decisions made by many people across multiple administrations and many institutions. The structural argument operates at the level of the aggregate condition, not at the level of individual conduct.
Nor of any named vendor.
It does not claim that vendors operating in Saskatchewan are exploiting client institutions in bad faith. The vendor whose $4 million non-deliverable the auditor cited may have been operating in entirely good faith. The structural argument is about the dependency relationship, not about vendor conduct.
What it does claim.
That the provincial auditor has documented, across at least 2 decades of audit cycles, a recurring pattern of institutional capability gaps at Crown corporations and provincial ministries in Saskatchewan. That the 2025 portfolio-level finding confirms the pattern is operating at the level of routine institutional delivery, not at the level of unusually difficult particular projects. That the $500 million EBMP Ames pair is the headline grade instance of a much broader baseline rate. That the structural consequence of institutional capability deficit is permanent vendor dependency, and that the modernization vocabulary launders the underlying capability condition as a transformation journey.
6 statements.
Each true on its own. Their relationship is the case.
And the discipline.
The strongest version refuses to indict individuals, refuses to dismiss legitimate vendor work, refuses to soften the institutional indictment. The pattern is sourced to the provincial auditor. The pattern operates across decades. The pattern is recognizable in any organization that has ever attempted institutional self-description in modernization language while paying external vendors for the underlying capability.
End transmission.
Filed from Regina, No sponsors, no trackers, open for correction.